The EU sanctions Iran, the UK sanctions Iran, then the US sanctions Iran, all in one day. The sanctions against Iranian and IRGC officials over alleged protest suppression, in which Iran calls the protesters rioters. Well, it appears that the EU, US, and EU countries are all working overtime to continue with their maximum pressure policy on Iran, which has gone through the test of time, yielding only one result, and that has been a failure. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at how these countries that sanction Iranian officials on the basis of human rights are all guilty of that crime. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Elijah Magnier, journalist and political analyst, joins us from Brussels. Also joining us is Shabir Rizvi, political analyst, who joins us from London. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Elijah Magnier, welcome to the program. We have, what are we looking at here? Well, let's go with the EU sanctions first. 37 more Iranian officials and entities. Basically an asset freeze and visa ban, blacklist over the rioters, targeting the Minister of Sports and the command of the Revolutionary Guards Corps in 12 regions of Iran. Now, this is the fourth round of sanctions coming from the EU. Aside from getting your reaction on this, do you agree that the EU as a whole has been very proactive, even compared to the US in some sense recently when it comes to the rioters, and then, of course, the sanctions against Iran and its officials and entities?
Well, I think one should not overestimate the EU decisions, because at the end of the day, when the US imposed sanctions on Iran and abandoned the JCPOA, no EU country respected the deal with Iran. And they all, without announcing it, respected the sanctions imposed on Iran. Therefore, all the thousands of sanctions imposed by the US, the EU is abiding by exactly the same sanctions against the Iranians. So what new can the EU bring on the table to Iran? The only thing that the EU is doing is making Iran more sensitive to the fact that Iran should not rely on the EU, and that the EU and the US are both on the same boat. They have the same behavior. One is dealing like a good cup, bad cup, and then you have the Europeans saying, well, maybe all these sanctions are emotional or reaction or non-binding, or we can think about it, or we can have a talk about it. But at the end of the day, they all aim to reach several objectives. First of all is to put pressure on Iran. Second, because of the JCPOA, they want Iran to return to the table, but even if they are saying that the deal is dead. Third, every time they impose sanctions, Iran is reacting harshly and is increasing the escalation rather than abiding by the European or the Americans' sanction and bowing to it. Also, if we look at the general picture in the Middle East, the Egyptian, the Syrian, the Iraqi armies have been kind of exhausted by all these wars, and what remains is only Iran in the Middle East with a strong army that can stand on its feet and can represent a deterrence against the US policy in the Middle East. So basically what we're seeing here is further pressure on Iran, further psychological pressure, but at the end of the day, in matter of practicality, nothing has changed.
Taking a look at the statement you made there in terms of the way Borrell thinks about this, Shabir Rizvi, I was trying to come up with an exact quote of Borrell where he has said, the EU Foreign Policy Chief, where he has said that the pressure by the EU at this point is maybe comes out of sensitivity towards Iran and, again, what they call protests, which we call rioters. But what our guest Elijah Magnier says, where it's actually both the US and the EU teaming up together and going through with these sanctions. But that comes, that is a very risky decision at this point in time to make, isn't it, when you have the type of reaction coming from the Islamic Republic, which, as I don't know if you're aware, but the Iranian foreign minister said that we will be thinking twice about being a member of the NPT and also whether we will go ahead, if the IRGC is labeled as a terrorist organization by the EU, to basically kick out the, I guess, the IAEA inspectors out of Iran. That's a very risky move to make in terms of sanctions with that type of reaction coming from Iran, isn't it?
Well, look, good afternoon. Thank you very much. At the end of the day, as our guest from Brussels has quite sort of admirably sort of put, and he's taken some of the thunder of what I was about to say. However, what's really very clear that over the last 43 years, now we are weeks away from the 43rd anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and also the 70th anniversary of when Mossadegh got rid of way back in 1953. So there are a number of interesting sort of anniversaries happening, and Iran has proved to be quite resilient over the last 43 years to survive all kinds of sanctions. If it was some other nation, it might have succumbed to all the sanctions that have been applied to the Islamic Republic. Not only has it survived, as I have commented previously, it has actually progressed at many, many levels. There's no point in sort of enumerating all the achievements that have been accomplished over the last 43 years. Suffice it to say that when the West talks about that women are marginalized, and it's really sort of ironic whenever you listen to the mainstream media, they always say that over 60% of the women, undergraduates and graduates in Iran, are women. It's over 60%, majority. So where is sort of this marginalization of women taking place in Iran? Yes, Iran has its own ethics, Iran has its own culture, Iran has its own way of operation, which may be different from what the West may think. The problem, the challenge with the West is not only are they working overtime, but they're actually working on steroids at this moment. On the one hand, they've got the problem in Ukraine, which they have sort of created themselves vis-a-vis Russia and the special operation, and on the other hand, they're trying to sort of create problems for Iran, and they're fighting another war with China. So I don't know how many fronts can Brussels or European Union, Washington, London, or Paris can accomplish. The main thing is the mindset of the Western elite is, like Mr. Borrell, you were just quoting, he not long ago said that only Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is jungle. So that's the mindset of the elite when they think that anyone other than European white-eyed blonde is from the jungle, less educated, less enlightened, with less culture, and it's their own culture which is very, very important. And I think the world is realizing that very clearly. And only recently, in the last few days, as you might have seen, the South African foreign minister has quite strongly criticized the USA for not having relationship with Russia. So, you know, there are different alliances which have taken place. The BRICS countries, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian, the rail link
right
from St. Petersburg all the way to Chabahar and to India. All these things are sort of really making Europe terribly angry that Iran is able to survive. And it's that anger which I think is coming out in these resolutions, which really have no meaning and they can't be really applied in any way at all.
Well, in a sense, I don't know if you agree, Elijah Magnier. I mean, taking a look at just this past 24 hours, you're looking at the US, the UK, and the European Union to come out and slap sanctions on Iran. Of course, we know that a lot of these sanctions are somewhat not only repetitive, because the IRGC members have been sanctioned since the year 2010, but they have defied any purpose of success based on the fact that, well, Iran has been resilient, as our guest there used that word, against sanctions. But what's very interesting over here is when it comes to the UK, that I'd like to ask you about, since it has gone ahead and imposed some sanctions. And one of the sanctions, aside from what I'm looking at over here, is the morality police, which it has done before, but it has gone again, put that sanction on there. And just this past week, you have the UK police commissioner, which came out, introduced a 2-year reform package for the Met, for the police there, where it has been described as rotten to the core, accused, again, the police of the UK, of being racist, misogynistic, where you have one scandal after another, the most recent one involving David Carrick. And I'm going to name it because we need to get names out since they are so good at doing that when it comes to Iran, who's a former Met Police now, but he pleaded guilty to 49 offenses, 24 counts of rape against 12 women between 2003 and 2020. So bad, it's described as rotten to the core of the police in the UK. The point I'm trying to make is that here you have the UK accusing Iran of so many things that it itself, in its police department, is described this way.
Well, perhaps you don't know that until 2021, police officers in the US were allowed to sleep with the people they detain in custody, in the police custody. And only last year, only 2021, mid-2021, the Congress changed the law. Also, we have the information coming from the US that 1,150 people died in police custody last year, when the year before there were 1,054. So the double standard and the hypocrisy of the West is a trademark that has been going on for a very long time. We should not look at what the UK is doing or what the EU is doing or what is happening in the US, because in the West, there is a mentality here that we can do what we want, you can't do what we do. So we make the law and we don't respect these laws. We break the international laws because it is our right. This is the colonialism mentality and approach, as your guest rightly said, Joseph Borrell, saying that we are the garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. So this is the mentality that in the West people think of the rest of the world. So there's no point in really making a distinction between the UK or the EU or the US or the whole 17 or 16% of the world that represent the West. This is why the Iranian government is turning toward the Shanghai Agreement, is welcome in the BRICS soon, is looking at the majority of the world population toward Asia and toward Latin America to link with, because there is no hope of the West. The EU doesn't have an army. The EU thinks that it is in its power to imitate the US and start imposing sanctions left, right, and center, thinking that this is the way to break the population's will and to force the population to look toward the West, saying, well, please lift these sanctions so we can do whatever you want. It's not going to happen. Since 1979, it's not happening in Iran. And the more there are sanctions imposed on Iran, the harsher the reaction is from the Iranian. As you rightly said, if Iran pulls out of the NPT, this is going to be a serious alarm raised in the West, saying, well, maybe Iran is really thinking about making a nuclear bomb. Well, I don't think it's a very bad idea, even if the foreign minister, Abdullahian, said that he received a call from Joseph Borrell saying, well, it is not binding, and these decisions of the parliament is really not something that we can take on board immediately. Okay. But at the end of the day, it is exactly the same US behavior that the EU is imitating, including the UK.
Yeah, the point that you make is important there, Elijah Magnier. I mean, Shabir Rizvi, Elijah Magnier says there, you know, what's the difference if the EU is making the statement or the UK or the US and blasting Iran, demonizing Iran, or Iran has said in many cases where this Iranophobia sentiment is what is being advertised by the three, so to speak. But when you have what Iran has said, this constant hybrid war against the Iranian nation, as Iran's foreign minister has said, psychological, media, and economic sectors all just being targeted by the EU, by the US, and by the UK, which is hosting not only a station that is called a terrorist media organization by Iran, but also by the state-funded media by the name of the BBC, targeting Iran, Persian language station, targeting Iran the way that it is. What should Iran do? Shouldn't Iran then respond? And shouldn't they be careful of how much and to what degree they are actually waging this war, again, not a physical war, but the media war against Iran and with the statements that they're making?
Well, look, as far as wars are concerned, there are many types of wars. We have the sanctions, the economic warfare, media warfare, cultural warfare, and as the Rahabar, the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khamenei, has quite clearly pointed out that the battle is not on the battlefield with arms and guns and soldiers. It's really a war of culture, the war of media, the war of trying to sort of persuade the people in other countries to turn against them. And of course, Britain, unlike USA and other nations in Europe, has a deep history of colonialism over the last 200 years. Although it's no longer a colonial power, but the Foreign Office has thick files in its drawers about how to manipulate and sort of organize dissent in countries. And I think, Washington works very closely with London because London has all kinds of information. It has academic centers like the School of African and Oriental Studies, which was set up by the intelligence services really to understand other cultures, other languages, so that they can manipulate those particular nations from an academic point of view. So there's a war taking place at multiple levels. And I think Iran obviously has to up its game as far as media is concerned. Of course, it's very difficult for Iran as one particular nation when the whole West is spending millions and billions of dollars either through PR agencies or through sort of mainstream media, through social media. All kinds of battles and wars are being fought, and Iran has to perhaps organize at that level itself, because there is certainly a lot of goodwill for Iran in the countries that are also former colonies of Britain, France, and in the recent past of the USA. They realize that USA is not a friend, and as someone famously said, that it's dangerous to be an enemy of USA, but it's fatal to be a friend of the USA. So the reality is that people are realizing that friendship with the USA is really a fatal decision that a nation takes. And a lot of nations are really realizing that situation very clearly.
Sure. Well, what do you make, Elijah Magnier, of the statement or the stance that the U.S. has taken when it comes to the JCPOA sanctions lifting talks, where in particular the U.S. Envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, has said, our focus is not these talks, our focus is what's going on inside of Iran. Now, I would like to take one example of one of their focuses, which I think it's a good one at this point in time, to talk about and how that the U.S. is actually focused on Iraq. And basically, to put it in a nutshell, they are trying to exert a lot of pressure on Iraq from the money flow that comes from Iraq in any shape or form when it comes to foreign currency, in particular the dollar, to Iran, where the Iraqi lawmakers are actually accusing the U.S. of weaponizing the dollar, in this case against Iran, where they have said, and this is a quote from one of them, working against us, in reference to the U.S., could lead to bringing down your governments. This is the American message, as it has been said by Iraqi lawmakers, some of them. So is this what the U.S. wants to do? Obviously, we know it's the regime change that they're after, but are we talking about these types of acts by the U.S. Instead of focusing on the sanction removal talks, which the Iran is somewhat waiting for them to see what's going to happen, although not indefinitely?
Well, the problem with Iraq is all the oil money goes to New York, and it is held by the U.S. Central Bank. Therefore, the Iraqis are really caught with the U.S. decision upon their sovereignty. And what the Americans did in Lebanon is to try out the market from the US dollar, creating a big catastrophic financial crisis in the country with the devaluation of the local currency because of that. So this is one of the weapons that the Americans use against the countries whenever they want to really bring them on their knees. So with Iraq is a bit different because the Americans need the Iraqi oil, because the Americans and the Europeans have decided to put a cap on the price of energy that's coming from Russia, and that is going to damage the US allies. So they can go to a certain point. We have seen that they allowed Iraq to a certain point to give back some of the money to Iran, because Iran is selling gas to Iraq and should pay for it, and is really back in paying the bills. But at the end of the day, what the Americans are trying to do is exactly what the Iranian officials said. Above the table, they say the JCPOA is dead. Under the table, they send messages and they say, we want to talk. The problem here is the Americans are very confident that the Iranians are not going to build the nuclear weapons. And because of that, there is no interest in America or in all the warmongers in the United States and in Europe to go and strike a deal with Iran. This is why they say the JCPOA is dead, because it is in the advantage of the US to see Iran under sanctions indefinitely, because Iran has areas of influence in the Middle East, it has allies, it's supporting the oppressed people in the Middle East and in Latin America. So this is not in the advantage of the US to relieve Iran from the sanctions. This is why they've taken their time. It is not the priority. Today, the priority is how, for the Americans, is how to bring the Europeans together under one banner, because we are suffering tremendously here in Europe because of the sanctions that we have imposed on Russia, and we're having a very harsh boomerang effect. This is why the Americans are trying to concentrate away from the JCPOA, because Iran is not compromising on its guarantee that is asking the Americans to provide.
Okay, I'm quickly going to ask this question as the last one, Shabir Rizvi. The world is changing. The tectonic shift has happened. Iran is moving away. Alliances are being built, like trade blocs, like the SCO, where Iran became a member, and the pivot that Iran has made in that regard is full steam ahead. Are we looking at a point where the U.S. will not be the center of gravity when it comes to its sanctions policy and its financial tentacles to be cut off, so that there will not be this strong dollar, which there are indications obviously of a de-dollarization, which therefore will then leave the U.S. out in the cold? Even with its allies like the EU, we're seeing a divergence, like in Ukraine, like when it comes to their China policy. Less than a minute, please.
Well, big topic, less than a minute. So I'll give you a sort of bullet point very quickly. The reality is that the dollar hegemony is being reduced and has reduced significantly over the last few years. But certainly since the Ukraine-Russia issue, it has moved really quite fast. Russia has been trading with India, with other nations in their own currency and also in gold. China, at the same time, is also trading with the Middle Eastern oil producers in yuan. So, you know, the whole power of the dollar is diminishing significantly.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off. We're just fresh out of time. It was a pleasure, though. Shabir Rizvi, political analyst from London. Elijah Magnier, thank you, journalist and political analyst from Brussels. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Kaveh and the team, it's goodbye.